Good evening. I'm James Meiskens. I'm interim president here at the Grad Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special event. Tonight, we're privileged to examine the acclaimed new book, The Triumph of Injustice: How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. We will do this examination with its celebrated authors, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman. And I suspect many of you saw their op-ed in the New York Times 2 weeks ago. Together, we'll look at the ways unfair tax systems lead to economic inequality, how inequality threatens democracy, and what we can do about it. Since the book's release just a few weeks ago, it's been a hot topic in almost every major media outlet, so we're thrilled that the authors have been able to come and join us this evening. In fact, they just dashed over here from an interview at CNN. Now, New Yorkers, as we all know, like to be in the center of the conversation. The Graduate Center is the place to be. Our public programs explore some of the most critical issues of our time and bring leading thinkers to our stage from CUNY and beyond, including, of course, our guest tonight. And we, of course, hope that you will come back many times to the Graduate Center for the conversations, stimulating conversations, such as the one we'll see in just a few moments. Our co-sponsor for tonight's program is the Graduate Center's renowned Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. Addressing pressing issues is a hallmark of the Stone Center. It's a leader in analyzing the disparities of income and wealth across countries and regions, and the public policies and institutions that shape those disparities. Tonight's program is also a part of our 2-year deep dive into understanding the promises and perils of democracy. Last year, we presented events that examined the foundation of democracy, such as freedom of the press, the role of the judiciary. This fall, we're turning to some of the significant challenges to democracy, including inequality and racism. We're grateful for the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York in underwriting this timely and significant project. Now I'm honored to introduce the extraordinary panel of scholars that we have here tonight, who will do a deep dive into the research, bringing fresh insights and an understanding to one of the biggest challenges we face, the causes and consequences of socioeconomic inequality. First, Emmanuel Saez, co-author of The Triumph of Injustice, is professor of economics and director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of California in Berkeley. In 2009, he was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association. He was named a MacArthur Fellow in 2010 for his research, and I quote, "in enhancing our understanding of the relationship between income and tax policy from theoretical and empirical perspectives, and for reinvigorating the field of public economics." That's a mouthful. Gabriel Zucman, the other co-author of The Triumph of Injustice, is professor of economics at Berkeley. He's also the author of The Hidden Wealth of Nations and co-director with Saez, Thomas Piketty, and others of the World Inequality Database, which is an extensive database on the historical evolution of income and wealth inequality. In 2019, he was awarded the Bernasser Prize, which was awarded annually to European economists under the age of 40 who've made outstanding contributions in the fields of macroeconomics and finance. And Lily Batchelder is the Robert C. Koppel Family Professor of Law at the NYU School of Law and affiliated professor at the NYU Wagner School of Public Service. In 2014 and 2015, she served as deputy director at the White House National Economic Council and deputy assistant to President Barack Obama, where she was responsible for tax and budget issues, including tax reform, retirement policy, and income benefits. She's the co-author of a recent study, Taxing the Rich, Issues and Options. And Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman is a distinguished professor here in economics at the Graduate Center, a senior scholar and core faculty member of the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. He's the author or editor of more than 25 books for academic and general audiences, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, and a prolific tweeter with, millions of followers. Krugman is the recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economics Association, the Prince Asterios Award from the King of Spain, and in 2008, the Nobel Prize in Economics. Our moderator for tonight is Janet Gornick. She's a professor of political science and sociology here at the Graduate Center and founding director of the Stone Center for Socioeconomic Inequality. This center also houses the U.S. Office of LIS, the widely used cross-national data archive. She is the co-author or co-editor of 3 books, Families That Work, Policies for Reconciling Parenthood and Employment, Gender Equality, Transforming Family Divisions of Labor, and Income Inequality, Economic Disparities, and the Middle Class in Affluent Countries. So having introduced our panel, we'll begin with Gabriel Zucman, who will give us a brief presentation of the highlights of the research of the book, and then the panel will come up here and join them on stage. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Zucman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Maiskins, and thanks to all of you for being here. What an honor, what a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about this book. So what we try to do in this book is 3 things. One is that we produce new statistics about how much each group of the population pays in taxes today in the US and has paid all the way back to 1913, taking into account all taxes paid at all levels of government. And we study the long-run changes in tax progressivity, and we try to explain, to tell the story of how the US moved from having the most progressive tax system in the world to a tax system today where the very wealthiest Americans, the 400 richest Americans, pay a lower tax rate than the middle class. Second is we provide some elements for a 21st century tax system. So many people have become convinced that tax avoidance, tax evasion, tax competition are laws of nature, and you cannot do anything against these things. And we want to explain why this is wrong, why these are in fact choices that governments make, and governments make other choices. And if there is a democratic demand for progressive taxation, we can make this work. And the third thing, and probably the most important, is that we developed a website, taxjusticenow.org, which is a user-friendly open source website where everybody can simulate their own tax reform. It is not for economists to say what tax rates should be applied, how the tax system should look like. It is obviously for the people through democratic deliberation and the vote, and what we try to achieve in this book is to make the tax debate more democratic, and that's why we developed this website. So let me start with the dramatic increase in inequality in the US, and one way to illustrate it, this increase is this graph that shows the evolution of the share of national income that's earned by the top 1% highest earners versus the bottom 50% the bottom 50% of the income distribution. In 1980, the top 1% earned about 10% of total national income. Today, it earns about 20% of total national income. The bottom 50%, went in the opposite direction, earning about 20% of national income in the early 1980s, down to barely more than 10% today. So the gains the relative gains made by just 1% of the population have been as large as the relative loss of 50% of the population, a group, by definition, 50 times larger. And the tax system is one very important way to regulate inequality. But today, here is how the tax system looks like in the US. So if you take into account all taxes paid at all levels of government, the total tax revenue in the US, total amount of tax revenue is 28%. That's total tax revenue divided by national income. Now, if you compute this statistic for each group of the population, what's the effective tax rate for each income group, what you're seeing is that the working class, defined as the bottom 50% of the income distribution, pays a bit less than 28%, 25, 26, 27%. You have some mild progressivity with the middle class and the upper middle class paying a bit more than the average of 28%. And then at the very, very top end, when you look at billionaires, the top 400, people who have more than $1.5 billion in wealth, their tax rate falls to 23%. The reason for this is illustrated on that graph. The reason why the working class pays a lot in taxes, there is this, you sometimes hear that the poor don't pay much taxes in the US. In 2012, Mitt Romney famously talked of the 47% of so-called takers who, according to him, do not contribute to the public coffers. But this is wrong. The working class pays quite a lot in sales taxes and in payroll taxes. The very rich, sales taxes are not very high for them. The individual income tax is the main tax that they pay, but at the very top, it becomes small. Take the case of Warren Buffett, which is the clearest illustration of the problem with tax progressivity today. Warren Buffett, according to Forbes magazine, is worth about $80 billion in wealth. His true economic income, what is it? It's his share of his company, Berkshire Hathaway's profits. Okay, so let's say he gets a 6% rate of return on his wealth. His true economic income is 6% of 80 billion, is something like $5 billion. Now, what does he pay in taxes? We know that because he discloses this. He pays a few million, just $2 or $3 million in taxes. How come? He instructs his company not to pay dividends. So the only income that's taxable is when he sells a few shares and realizes a bit of capital gains, and that's it, And so his taxable income is like $10, $20 million. He paid $2-3 million. That's an effective tax rate essentially of 0%. This is a major departure, the current tax system, from the history of the US. The US invented progressive income taxation with very high top marginal income tax rate of more than 90% in the middle of the 20th century. The US invented sharply progressive estate taxation with estate tax rates of close to 80% from the 1930s to the late 1970s. No continental European country ever had such high top marginal income tax rates. No, France never came close to any of this, nor Italy, nor Spain. And sometimes when you talk about that, people say, oh, but nobody really paid those rates. The US might have pretended to tax the wealthy under Roosevelt and subsequent administrations, but never genuinely did so. And so we take that seriously, and we try, we compute in the book what was the effective rate paid by the wealthiest Americans, and that's the result here. We find that the top 0.1% highest earners paid about 60% of their income, all taxes included, during the middle of the 20th century. And then, you had this big decline in tax progressivity. So the point here is that the US tax system really was progressive, not only on paper, but also in actual fact, and today, is basically not progressive or barely anymore. The reason why the US tax system was so progressive in the middle of the 20th century is something that's not really well understood. It's not essentially because of the individual income tax, because the reason, the 90% top marginal income tax rate, it's true that very few people paid those rates. It was by design. You need to remember the history of those rates. In 1943, Franklin Roosevelt goes to Congress and he makes a famous speech and he says, I think that no American should have an income of more than $25,000 at the time after paying taxes, so the equivalent of several millions of today's dollars. And therefore, I propose 100% top marginal income tax rate above $25,000 on all sources of income. So he makes this speech, and people in Congress, hesitate a little bit. 100% is a lot, and they agree on 93%. And so that's the history. Why do I tell you this history? Because everybody understands that the reason that for these high tax rates was not to collect revenue. The point was explicitly about reducing inequality, making sure that nobody earns more than several millions in a given year. And so it's not through the individual income tax that the US system was very progressive, it's mostly through the corporate tax. The corporate tax at the middle of the 20th century did generate a lot of tax revenue, and because equity ownership is very concentrated, when the corporate tax rate is very high, shareholders in effect pay high taxes. That's something which is very basic, but we actually discovered in writing that book, which is that at some point the corporate tax, the federal corporate income tax, generated as much revenue as a fraction of national income as the individual income tax, that for a brief period of time in the 1950s, then it declined, but that's, through the corporate tax that the tax system achieved its huge progressivity, and now the corporate income tax is essentially, is almost dead, collects 1% of national income following the Trump tax reform. So where does this take us? And that's the last, figure before I conclude these brief remarks. The future of tax progressivity, there are many ways to increase the progressivity of the tax system. The corporate tax is one tool, but it's too crude in many ways because it's just one rate. The US could increase the corporate tax rate to 50%, but it's too crude an instrument. A more powerful instrument is a progressive tax on wealth. Here, this graph shows how the tax system would look like, keeping everything the same, but just adding the Warren wealth tax, which is a tax of 2% above $50 million and 3% above $1 billion. With just a wealth tax like that, you double the effective tax rate on billionaires, from 23% today to 46%. So let me conclude by saying, there is this widely held view that external or technical constraints make tax justice impossible. And sometimes people refer to the European experience with wealth taxation, and they say, look, it was a failure. Most countries abolished their wealth taxes. And that's true. It was a failure, a very important intellectual and political failure. But we can learn from that failure. We can design taxes in a different way. In Europe, you have tax competition. You move away from France. You stop being taxed in France. The US is different. Taxation is based on citizenship. Europe did very little to fight tax evasion through tax havens. It is changing, and the US is doing much more. So the point is that there is an infinity of possible futures in terms of tax progressivity, future policy path. And I'll conclude with this. Last week, Esther Duflo won the Nobel Prize in Economics. She has a famous paper which is titled The Economist as a plumber. And we love that. We view ourselves as plumbers. Look, there are leaks in the tax system. There are things that don't work, but we can fix the leaks. We can improve the machinery, and if there is a democratic demand for more economic justice and more tax progressivity, this can happen. Thank you very much. inviting my colleagues to join me on the stage.
Okay, thank you, President Meiskens, for your generous introduction, and thank you, Gabriel, for providing highlights from the book and introducing our audience to those rather stunning graphics. So let me just start by welcoming all of you here on behalf of all of us on the stage. Welcome to the Graduate Center. Welcome to those of you here in the Prashansky Auditorium, and to those who are joining us by live stream. So let me start by offering a very brief outline of the arc of this evening's conversation. The book that has brought us here this evening is action-packed. As you've seen already, it paints a very detailed portrait of the distribution of the tax burden in the United States today and historically, and it lays out a complex and ambitious set of proposed policy reforms. So there's an enormous amount to consider in 45 minutes. So here's what you can expect. I'm going to begin by asking the authors and the panelists to reflect on the ideal outcomes. What are we aiming to achieve? Second, I'm going to ask some questions about these tax proposals. The overarching question is, will these proposed reforms bring about the intended goals? Third, the book has already attracted widespread attention. As I imagine many of you know, it's been burning up Twitter especially. And I'm going to turn our attention to some of the critiques that have been discussed publicly and a few that have been added by our panelists. And finally, I'm going to ask them to reflect on the theme that also brought us here this evening, and that is the interplay between tax reform, tax justice, if you will, and democracy. So let me begin with the question of goals and metrics for success. When I was a graduate student studying public policy, my teachers drilled into my head the old adage about policy analysis: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So let's start with the question, what's broke? And of course, that takes us to the corollary, what are we aiming for? So let me start with Emmanuel and Gabriel. In your book, of course, with a focus on the US, you highlight two distinct but intertwined broken elements. Economic inequality has risen sharply, and the tax system has grown increasingly regressive. So my first question to you is, talk to us a little bit about the ideal outcomes. What should we aim for with respect to levels of economic inequality and the distribution of the total tax burden? And what criteria or reasoning would shape your answer to those questions?
Very good. So let me get started. So we know that our economies grow over time. Thanks, to technological progress, all our incomes are rising. That's what has been happening over the last 2 centuries. But for growth to be sustainable, it needs to be equitably distributed. And that's what happened in the United States after World War II up to 1980. When you look at how economic growth was benefiting each group, it was really a tide lifting all boats together. Now, in the period from 1980 to the present, the picture is totally different. So we crunched all the numbers, and we found that actually the incomes of the bottom 50% have essentially stagnated. So we are in an economy that doesn't work for at least half of the population, the bottom 50%. And while there is macroeconomic growth, that growth is felt only for people, in the upper middle class, and especially the rich who are growing like China. And that is just not sustainable. And we are seeing, the crises coming in, protests, disenchantment with the current situation. And our view is that this is fixable. If society wants to fix the problem of unequal growth, there are tools that the government or that society can use through its government. And here in our book, we propose a blueprint for that. So our criterion for success, let's make sure that moving forward, economic growth is equitably distributed.
Thank you. Lily, let me ask you to weigh in on that question. How do you think about the goals in terms of economic inequality and the distribution of the tax burden, and what are the criteria and metrics for success?
Yeah. I think it's hard to say exactly what the ideal is, but that we are quite far from it. Ultimately, that's a choice for the voters. but there is a lot of space for the US to narrow disparities in income and wealth. And I would add intergenerational mobility. So we have the second highest level of income inequality among OECD high-income countries. We have the highest level of wealth inequality. And we also have very low levels of intergenerational mobility. So another CUNY professor, Miles Korak, has written a lot about this. But to a large extent in the US, a child's economic outcomes are determined by their parents' socioeconomic status. And so I think all of those are reasons why we're, at least in my view, very far from the ideal. In terms of how to address this, I would probably collapse both the tax and transfer system. There's also things before either of those, like the minimum wage, that are important. But one can redistribute through either. And the US has tended, compared to European countries, to rely a bit more heavily on the tax system than the transfer system. Rather, we rely sort of equally, and in European countries rely very heavily on transfers. And if that's the way we like to do things, that's fine, but it does imply that we then need to be raising a lot more revenue from the very wealthy because we may not support as much broad-based taxes like a VAT as European countries do.
Okay, I think many people on the sort of center left, I'm basically a Rawlsian. That is basically what I want is a society which is the society I would choose if I didn't know who I was going to be. Which means that the strong, since money matters relatively little to people at the top and a lot to people further down, it means a society where you try to have relatively low inequality, a high safety net, and so on. And that's how far you would want to go on that is a tough question. How you start to think about how do you value different kinds of families? How do you value how concave is people's utility and income? All these questions, which turn out, I think, in practice to be not important, because the one thing that's clear is that where we are now is way off to the side from where we ought to be, and that anything that is likely to happen politically in the lifetimes of any of us on the stage here is going to fall far short of where you would want to go. And if we look at those advanced countries that do much, much more redistribution than the United States does, none of them appears to have gone too far. Even Denmark, there's no real sign that any economic damage is done by their redistributive policies. So the answer is just more, as much as we can get. And however much of your tax reform, however much of the additional social programs we can get, take everything we can, because we're very unlikely to overshoot.
Okay. What do we want? More. Okay. Actually, Paul, that was a great segue, because now I do want to turn our attention to the tax proposals themselves. For those of you who get excited by policy analysis, this is the book for you. So we didn't give Gabriel a lot of time to really describe the tax plan, and I do want to give them time. So the tax proposals that are laid out in this book are, assuming I'm reading it properly, essentially it's a tax plan with 4 legs, really. And those are the following, briefly. They call for reforming corporate taxation, aimed at, among other goals, consolidating taxation across national borders. Second, for reforming income taxation, aimed at, again, with multiple goals, equalizing tax liability across categories of income, in particular, labor and capital. Third, and the piece that's gotten so much attention in the last weeks, launching a high-end wealth tax with the key goals including weakening incentives to hide income inside wealth, which I assume you'll talk about a little bit, and reducing the accumulation of pre-tax wealth. And the fourth is something they call a national income tax, specifically to fund health and education. So my question, or my request is, to either of you, treat us to your, I'm sorry, this is a terrible cliche, but treat us to your elevator speech, and that is the 2-minute summary, or maybe 3 minutes, of the logic underlying the tax reform package. Why these 4 overarching components, and why not others?
Yeah, so let me try. The 4 components are important. The corporate income tax is important because right now, with the low corporate income tax rate of 21%, there is a danger The danger is that the progressive income tax is going to be undermined. The reason for that is when the corporate income tax rate is too low, what rich people do is they incorporate. They become companies, they earn income through their corporations, subject to the 21% rate, and if they don't need the money, to consume, they keep saving their money in the corporation, and so in effect, the progressive income tax becomes a mere consumption tax. So that's the problem. You need to fix that. It's impossible. It will be impossible, for instance, for the US to increase the top marginal income tax rate tomorrow to 70% without fixing first the corporate income tax. And fixing the corporate tax means making a serious effort at fighting tax havens, tax competition, and profit shifting. And what we explain is basically the form of globalization that we've embraced so far, characterized by tax competition, is not the only possible form of globalization. Instead of tax competition, we can have tax harmonization. So, for instance, we could make an agreement on minimum corporate tax a condition for signing new free trade agreements, putting taxes at the center of free trade agreements. You can increase global corporate tax rates like that, and you safeguard the progressive individual income tax. And once you fix the corporate tax, you can fix the income tax, you can increase the top marginal income tax rates, that's easy. But if you fix the individual income tax, and we get to the third part of the plan, you're not addressing all the problems. You still have the Warren Buffett problem that I described briefly, which is, look, if you had a 90% top marginal income tax rate on taxable income, Buffett's tax bill would change from 0% of his true economic income to 0% of his true economic income, which is still a bit too low. And so the proper way to tax billionaires who can own a ton of wealth while having little taxable income is through a wealth tax. Or to put it differently, there are two indicators of your capacity to pay taxes: income and wealth. And the fourth component is, look, if you want to collect much more revenue in the US, and that's important for health, for education, for child, family benefits, the way that European countries do that is the VAT, value-added tax, and we think it's outdated. And we think that the US could leapfrog the VAT and create a tax that's broader and less regressive than the VAT, which we call a national income tax, which instead of taxing consumption like the VAT, would tax all income. So that's the plan.
Before I move on to ask the panelists, let me ask one specific question, and again for Emmanuel and Gabriel. The package that you propose is very elegant, and the four pieces, as you just suggested, Gabriel, are intertwined. What happens if it comes apart? If you get the income tax and the wealth tax fails, or the corporate tax is shifted, but et cetera. Can the four pieces operate independently? Because they're all they're all bold. So what happens if you get one or two of them and not the other two? Will the mountain collapse?
Let me respond to that one. Fixing just the income tax is the more moderate, candidates on the Democratic platform. That's going back to the rates we had under Obama or under the Clinton administration, fixing some loopholes in the individual income tax, and that's good to do. It's probably not going to dramatically change the picture of the problem of inequality in the United States. Fixing the corporate tax rate that has been really damaged by the Trump administration, now it raises very little income, is a very high priority, because if we fail there, the whole system, gets undermined. The wealth tax comes on top if you're more radical and you really want to tackle, the accumulation of great wealth more aggressively. The national income tax is important if you want to be ambitious to develop the US social welfare state. And we hear a lot in the news about Medicare for all proposals. So just in a nutshell, the reason why the current healthcare system in the US is not sustainable, it's because in the US, the worker has to pay full price regardless of his wage. So if you have health insurance through your employer, and now it's mandated, employers have to offer it, essentially the worker bears the burden because it's paid by the employer, but effectively it's part of the labor cost, so it reduces the compensation one for one. And so the average cost of a healthcare plan is like $13,000 for highly paid, professors. That's not that much, but if you make only $40,000, it's an unbearable burden. And that's why in the book we describe, those costs as an extra tax that's not run by the government, it's run through employers. The government has told employers, you have to manage this piece, and it's a tax per worker. Very unfair and unsustainable with increasing healthcare costs. And if you want to replace that by a funding, based on ability to pay, you have to develop one of these new, broad tax. And if you do that well, you can get the workers, pay increase, by what they currently pay or their employer pay. And in exchange of that, they will have to pay a tax, but the tax won't be as big if your pay is low.
Lily, let me ask you to step in. I think of Lily as one of the great tax geeks of the world. So the question would be, and of course I know you've reviewed this four-legged stool, or such as it is, which components of this Saez-Zucman tax proposal especially excite you? Which have the most promise to achieve their intended consequences? And which components worry you?
I think the wealth tax clearly has captured the political imagination, and I think with good reason. It's a way to raise a large amount of revenue from the very wealthy. It has some advantages, which I could discuss relative to other options for raising revenue from the wealthy. It can't be avoided by investing in multinationals that shift their profits overseas, because their stock price will reflect that, and so that would also be taxed by the wealth tax. I'd say my one worry, or one of my worries about it, which we may get to, is the constitutional risk. But I also thought the international proposals were really interesting. So there's sort of a hybrid of some other proposals out there. President Obama had proposed a minimum tax. We actually have a minimum tax now. That was one of the elements of the 2017 tax reform, although not in the form that I would particularly support. I think their form would be much more advisable. And then there's been a lot of discussion over time about allocating the worldwide profits of multinationals by their location of their sales. And this is something that OECD is actively considering. What I thought was really clever in the book is they talk about sort of combining these two and saying, let's have a minimum tax, and then let's say the US, if we get 20% of the sales of a company, we can collect 20% of tax on 20% of that income plus 20% of however they fall short from a global minimum tax. And so that way we can sort of pick up the extra if other countries don't impose the minimum tax, which is a way to induce more cooperation. So I thought that was really interesting. I'd say the one other component I'd mention that might slightly worry me, although it's really just a friendly amendment, is the proposal to tax capital gains at the same rate as ordinary income, which in general I think is a fabulous idea. My one concern is the way that Congress's estimators estimate increasing the capital gains rate. They think that if we increase it even by, maybe 6 percentage points from now, that it might start losing revenue because of something we have called the realization rule, where people don't have to pay the capital gains tax till they sell the asset. There is an indication that that revenue maximizing rate would increase quite dramatically if we repealed a loophole that allows all capital gains to be tax exempt upon death. And I'm guessing that would be a friendly amendment. If you went above maybe 50%, then you need to start thinking about something called an accrual tax, which is taxing gains as they accrue rather than waiting till they're realized. So those would be some other things I might put on the table as complements to that, although I generally love the idea of taxing capital gains the same as ordinary income.
Thank you very much. And we're going to come back to the questions of both constitutionality and also revenue maximization. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the critiques. We're not going to just have a love fest all evening here because that wouldn't be interesting. There's been quite a lot of debate online about many aspects of this, and I want to raise a few of them, 3 actually, but before I do, I actually have a question for Paul. We've been talking about the book, actually the whole Stone Center has been talking about the book kind of around the clock for the last at least 2 days or more. So Paul, as we were talking, you raised a fundamental methodological question or challenge. You suggested that the book, the Saez and Zucman approach, might be producing clear and consistent answers, but perhaps to the wrong question. So would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so let me just say that this is a fabulous book. It's incredible work, and it's eye-opening on many fronts. Which is nothing I say should be taken as diminishing in any sense the praise. This is a landmark piece of work. Okay, here's my concern. What a lot of people are going to take away from the book is basically the giant flat tax chart. And that chart, now there's a whole, that's quite different from what many other people in the tax area say, and a lot of that has to do with painfully technical issues, which the Stone Center has been, and I have to say, I'm not sure I can, definitions of income and all of that, and I would really rather not think about those. But anyway, it's sort of 16 Tylenol level stuff there. But there's a fundamental difference between the way you guys do it and the way most people do it, which is that most estimates do things like try to allocate the corporate tax, saying that some part of the corporate tax is borne by workers, and they do this. We do this all along. We do estimates of tax incidence, and you guys have a very principled explanation. I found that October working paper extremely helpful of why you don't want to do that. You just want to say this is what people actually pay. Which is a way that is consistent with national income accounts, and I understand all of that, but in some sense it's, and you want to make a very clear distinction between the distribution of taxes and the effects of tax reform. Trouble is that almost all policy questions are about the effects of tax reform, which is what you deliberately eschew doing. I mean, bad old joke about the guy who's in a balloon that's been blown off course, and he passes over somebody on the ground and yells down to him, "Where am I?" And the guy says, "You're in a balloon." And it's and the specific case here is, what do we want to say about the 2017 tax cut? Big cut in corporate taxes. The theory of the case, which some not entirely crazy economists bought, was that this would lead to massive inflows of capital from the world, which would drive down the rate of return on capital, drive up wages, so that in effect, it was really a tax cut for workers. I believe that was not true, and I think evidence is suggesting that's not true, but that is a question that involves exactly the kinds of behavioral responses that you guys leave out, and I think that's something that, you do not do this, but there's a kind of a structural bait and switch that might happen as people look at your chart, use your tool, and think that it is telling them what the effects of tax reform are going to be, which it doesn't necessarily do.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and we've thought very, very hard about that. And let me try to defend the methodology that we use. So, we totally agree that taxes affect behavior. The corporate tax, the standard theory says you tax profits and investment is going to fall, and there's going to be less capital in the economy, and capital makes workers, productive, and so with less capital, wages will be lower. And that's fine, that's a plausible theory, it's difficult to test, and we're not denying that this is possible in theory. But you cannot study the world as it is, or as it was last year, with that framework. That is, last year, there was a certain level of national income, a certain distribution of income that already reflected all the behavioral responses to taxes. So maybe if the corporate tax had been lower last year, wages would have been higher, but the corporate tax was what it was, and wages were where they were, and to analyze that world, the real data, not a counterfactual world, to analyze the world as it is and as it was, the only meaningful way is to say, look, wages adjusted, taxes had all sorts of effects, and after these adjustments took place, what the corporate tax did is very simple. It reduced the amount of dividends that shareholders could receive, and it reduced the amount of profits that shareholders could reinvest in their companies. And so, in effect, it was a tax on shareholders. And by the same logic, payroll taxes, whether remitted by employers or employees is irrelevant, they reduced the labor compensation. There was a wedge between the labor costs for employers and what workers received, and so they reduced the wage of workers. So that's how we think that you should study the past. Now, the future, and I agree with you, that we care both about the past and kind of putting numbers and creating series that reveal how the US has changed. And we also care about the future, and to analyze the future, you want to do differently. You want to have behavioral responses. You want to say, if the corporate tax was increased, not only the tax rate of shareholders would change, but also the incomes of the various groups of the population would change. And you need to be explicit about that, but you can only make that to think about the future, about a counterfactual world. You can't do that to think about the actual world with its actual level and distribution of income.
Can I just say, I think the distinction between past and future is not that clear here. If you're comparing the progressivity of the tax system in 1960 with the progressivity of the tax system in 2019, the question we surely want answered is, how did those changes in taxes affect where we are, which is in effect it's a tax policy change. So it's just saying these are the facts on what was paid does not answer that question.
Very quickly, what I would say is maybe when the corporate tax was very high in the 50s and 60s, maybe it depressed wages. Who knows? Maybe if we believe the standard theories. But if you want to say that, then you need to be explicit about the fact that wages could have been higher in the 50s and in the 60s, and that the corporate tax reduced those wages. And no, that's not what we're doing. What we're saying is the wages were what they were, maybe lower than they could have been. And in that context, what the corporate tax did, was reducing how much shareholders could get in income.
Can I just hog 45 more seconds? This can sound like it's always, behavioral arguments are always in favor of the right, but not necessarily. One of the best case I've seen for minimum wages as opposed to purely wage subsidies is the claim that wage subsidies may be partially passed on to employers. So you would be missing, in this framework, you'd be missing that case for minimum wages.
30 seconds, just to answer another, follow up on this, on what would be the effect of if we followed the standard methodology, because it's an interesting question. Can you redo your series with the standard methodology? And what you would get is that the tax system would be even less progressive, in fact more regressive, because if you allocate part of the corporate tax to workers instead of allocating all of it to shareholders, then you're going to have a higher tax rates for ordinary workers and lower tax rates for shareholders. And so this giant flat tax that becomes regressive at the very top will in fact be even more regressive. So,
thank you. I'm going to just push us on to, that's what we're going to continue later, clearly. There are two issues that have come up in a lot of the public reactions to the wealth tax, and they're somewhat unrelated, but I'm going to pose them both to you, Lily, in a two-part question, because I know you've written about both of these. I think everybody obviously can pick up on this. It's the wealth tax piece in the book that's gotten so much attention, partly because the plan that they have described is now one that's been supported by Senator Warren and something a sort of something related to it now also by Sanders. Two critiques that have gotten a lot of airtime. The economist Larry Summers argues that the revenue estimates are wildly high. In fact, he claims that the revenue estimates are high by a factor of 8. That's a big number. So partly drawing on other countries' experience, Summers and his colleague Natasha Sarin have re-estimated this. And again, as I said, they think that Emmanuel and Gabriel's revenue estimates are just absurdly high. So Lily, I know, my first question is, can you relatively briefly help our audience to sort of sort out fact from fiction, who's right? And the second question, which you alluded to, which is a completely different area of discussion, is the argument that the wealth tax is unconstitutional. So could you comment on both of those?
So in terms of the Sarin and Summers critique, this is something she mentioned that I am a tax geek, which I proudly agree with. This has been a subject of great debate among the tax geeks. But there's really sort of 5 issues in trying to estimate how much a wealth tax would raise. So one is just how much wealth is there in the US and how is it distributed before taxes. And before we really got into this debate, I had not realized how uncertain that is. We don't have great data on wealth, and there's sort of 3 different ways to try to estimate it, and you end up with very different results, both for the aggregate amount of wealth, but particularly for how it's distributed across the wealth distribution. The second is how a wealth tax would affect this figure. So would there be real behavioral responses of people saving less? The third is what would be tax avoidance and evasion to a wealth tax? And then the last 2 are sort of how could a wealth tax proposal get watered down, either through the legislative process or through the regulatory and lobbying process that follows. So as Janet mentioned, Sarin and Summers estimate much lower revenues raised from a wealth tax, depending on which number you're focusing on, 60 to 88% less. I should emphasize that none of these, as far as I can tell, are revenue estimates in the congressional sense of assuming real behavioral responses. And that's not a terribly crazy idea in the sense that savings isn't terribly responsive to taxes at current levels. But if you're actually going to put this proposal through Congress, the estimators would incorporate some real behavioral response. But the big difference between Sarin and Summers and Gabriel and Emmanuel's estimates, a lot of it is methodological. They are extrapolating Sarin and Summers from estate tax data, which just systematically generates lower estimates of how much wealth there is at the very top. There are some methodological differences that might be 16 Tylenols also. I would say several of them, I think probably Gabriel and Emmanuel have the better case. And so that would, maybe reduce the differential to 30% less revenue rather than 60, 88% less revenue. The remainder is really about tax avoidance and evasion. And they assume a 15% avoidance evasion rate. Nobody knows for certain what that's going to be. The one caution I would give about the Sarin and Summers estimates is they are looking at the estate tax evasion rate. And there are ways in which one can evade the estate tax that don't really work with a wealth tax. So the estate tax and the gift tax, they're part of the same thing, are only imposed once per generation. And a lot of the avoidance techniques involve taking that one point in time and artificially and temporarily devaluing the value of assets that are transferred and then lifting those restrictions. And that just doesn't work under an annual wealth tax because then you need to keep those restrictions in place. So I tend to think the estate tax, for a bunch of reasons, is not a great model there. That said, so much will depend on if a wealth tax was enacted, how it is drafted, what regulations are issued under it. And I think another critique that they're sort of implicitly raising is that it will be drafted poorly, and there'll be lots of loopholes. And I don't think it's fair to assume that a proposal will be changed in ways that the person is not proposing. But I do think as we think of different options for taxing the wealthy, we want to think about which ones are most likely to get watered down through lobbying, et cetera. I personally think on this score, a wealth tax is actually pretty good because it enables policymakers to write on a blank slate. And the income tax has a lot of preferences that if you went that route are likely to be incorporated. So I'll shift to constitutionality. So this all goes back to a provision in the Constitution that says that all direct taxes must be apportioned among the states. And this provision and that's a problem because then you would be saying that if there's a wealth tax and it's a direct tax, then people in Mississippi on average have to pay the same amount of wealth tax as someone in New York, even though New Yorkers are in general more wealthy. So this goes back to the 3/5 compromise, not a great period in our nation's history, where we decided to say that people who were held in slavery were only counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional seats and also for revenue purposes. So that in and of itself might be a reason a court would say, you know, it's been a long time, we're not sure if there's ambiguity that we want to strike down a wealth tax on those grounds. But if they don't feel that way, the big issue is that it's just not clear what a direct tax is. So during the Constitutional Convention, Madison wrote in his notes that someone asked, what do you mean by a direct tax? And then he writes, no one answered. So there have been, some cases, I won't go through the gory details, but it's really unclear what is meant by a direct tax and whether it includes a wealth tax. And I think when you have that degree of ambiguity, it leaves it up to a large extent to the Supreme Court justices to vote their conscience. And given how the court is currently constituted, I think that creates a real risk that this could be struck down. Justice Roberts has already said something in a prior case suggesting he might think a wealth tax was unconstitutional. On the other hand, I could also see him taking the approach that he did in the ACA legislation of this is major bill passed by Congress. I'm going to respect, what Congress has done, and especially when the Constitution is ambiguous, I'm going to do that. But I think all of this means there's a real risk that, in my mind, counsels, for reasons that I could go into, that a wealth tax should be framed as a part of the income tax, which is clearly constitutional under the 16th Amendment, or potentially there should be a hybrid where you say we're enacting a wealth tax, and if the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional, then our backup is we're doing an accrual tax or something that's very similar to a wealth tax but is even more clearly part of the income tax system.
Thank you. That's why we have a law professor here. So, and we do still have a constitution, right, as of this morning? I hope so. I haven't heard any news today, so I don't really know. I'm going to turn our attention to the question of democracy. And again, that's the framework that has brought us here this evening. The Graduate Center, as President Muyskens mentioned, is in the middle of a 2-year initiative supported by the Carnegie Foundation on the question of the promise and perils of democracy. And the theme for this autumn is, what are the current threats to democracy? So this book is really, I think, fits just extremely well in this discussion. So Emmanuel and Gabriel, throughout the book, you argue squarely that inequities in the U.S. tax system represent a fundamental threat to American democracy. The tax system you describe as a system of plutocracy, and you note that the wealthy have an ever-increasing capacity to shape policymaking and government for their own benefit. So let's just take a closer look. In your discussion beyond the Laffer Curve, I think most of you probably remember from Econ 101, the Laffer Curve, famously drawn on a napkin, is the curve that's supposed to tell us which tax rate is going to maximize revenue. You argue in the book that deconcentrating inequality may justify designing a tax system that does not maximize revenue. Isn't that economic heresy? Are you going to lose your licenses to practice economics and have to become plumbers? How will you defend a tax plan that is designed not to maximize revenue? What's the argument in terms of?
it's you know, we are going to be excommunicated, I think, from the economist profession for that chapter and other things that we do in the book, but we're doing this for good reasons. And what we're trying to do in the book is to help the public reconnect with the history and the tradition of tax progressivity and tax justice that's been so important in the US. You have two traditions, and we start the book by telling this history. There is a strong anti-tax, anti-government, anti-democracy tradition that's largely rooted in slavery, and you see that when you look at the tax systems of Virginia in the 19th century. And there is also a progressive tradition that says, look, an extreme concentration of wealth in and of itself is a bad thing, is corrosive for society, for the social compact. And so one of the roles of the tax system, the main role of the tax system is to generate revenue, and for that you don't want to be on the wrong side of the Laffer Curve when revenue falls, when you increase the tax rate. But another very important role of the tax system, and historically that's played a big role in US society, is to limit the concentration of wealth. You see that with the speech by Roosevelt that I mentioned, this idea that nobody should earn more than a certain income. Why? What's the reasoning behind that? The reasoning is that for most of the population, wealth is safety, security is a good thing, but for the very, very rich, wealth is not safety, wealth is power. And so an extreme concentration of wealth means an extreme concentration of power. The power to influence policy making, the power to influence markets. And you want to use the tax system, you might want to use the tax system to reduce this power and to regulate inequality. And we think that's an important rationale.
Emmanuel, do you want to add to that before I turn to our other economists that seem to please the audience? Okay. Paul, let me ask you to comment on this sort of larger topic. Are there trade-offs between standard fiscal policy goals, implementing optimal tax rates and balancing budgets and maximizing growth on the one hand, and reducing economic inequality in the service of strengthening democracy on the other hand? And if so, how should fiscal policymakers address these trade-offs?
So first of all, I think there's your case that in some sense increased wealth at the top is not only sort of irrelevant, but actually a positive bad. That's a very American tradition. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, I think, said if there are men big enough to buy the government, they will buy the government. And so just curbing extreme wealth at the top is a valuable goal in itself. And that's the fact that no one would in American politics today would dare say such a thing when they would when people you don't think of as radicals were willing to say it a century ago is telling us something. And I also think I think it's tremendously important to say that GDP is not a goal, where the economy is about people. And one of the things that I really learned before this work, but from Emmanuel, from your work with Peter Diamond, is that if we want to think about how much should we tax people at the top, the first thing we should be saying is we don't really care how much income they have, and really they don't care either at a fundamental level. And so the goal is basically to extract as much revenue, and if that reduces GDP, but doesn't reduce the incomes of anybody below the top 0.1%, no one cares. We shouldn't care. I actually, though, maybe this is more of a vague impression from the book, but I actually ended up feeling a little more optimistic about the role of wealth in politics, because a lot of the history you give of how tax rates came down so much it was not so much there was crude influence wielding by, clearly there is that, but it's not just that the Koch brothers bought themselves a lower tax rate. A lot of it is the perception by technocrats, by policy people that there's too much tax avoidance, that we're engaged in international tax competition, and that we need to bring down the rates. And to the extent that is sincere, and I think at least is to some extent it's sincere, if we can make the case that that is not true, that there's much more scope for taxing corporate profits, there's much more scope for taxing high incomes than people have been claiming, then that can make a big difference. I think probably the best argument for higher corporate taxation we can make is the discovery that all of those overseas investments, or a very large part of those overseas investments, are not real. That all of the money, it's not that corporations are building factories in low tax in Ireland. They're just recording their profits in Ireland, and that's a pretty powerful revelation. It suggests that the need to have low taxes to keep business in the United States is much less than has been claimed.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions on this under the rubric of thinking about democracy in a sort of larger way. So another question for Emmanuel and Gabriel, and then for the others if they'd like. The book is, of course, about tax policy largely, and you say much less about social policy. So I want you to reflect a little bit on the link between achieving these tax reforms and winning social policy and labor market reforms. On the one hand, the tax reforms and social policy and labor market reform. So what I mean by that is that many observers of the United States argue that U.S. workers and their families need many things: access to universal health insurance, universal pre-K, affordable housing, sick pay, and a host of labor market regulations and reforms. The U.S. meager social protection system also corrupts the democratic process. So my question for you is, do you feel some obligation to link your proposed tax reforms to proposals for social and labor market policy reform? And if I could add to that, do you think the candidates you're advising on tax policy should also be obligated to spell out these links?
Yeah, no, so this is a very good question. So governments, they reflect, the values of society, and they do many things. So on one part, we pull together a significant fraction of our income through taxes. Even in the US, where we don't like taxes that much, we still pull together, 28% of our incomes, and we do that, to do a number of things, pay for programs, transfers, fund education, healthcare, retirement. And our book is about taxes. It's one aspect of government. We're not claiming we're capturing everything that's critical. Taxes are going to be central at the high income end because they really regulate concentration of income and wealth, but obviously many other aspects of government policies, how you use government funds, which programs you fund, and more broadly, what sort of regulations you have, to increase the power of the workers, to negotiate better wages, minimum wage, union power is very important. And candidates, I should say, obviously they look at all those things. Their platforms are not only about taxes. So it's not like we're claiming those things are not interesting. We are tax experts, inequality experts. We wrote about taxes. We've done work, on how transfers affect the distribution of income, and maybe that would be the topic for another book.
Paul or Lily, any comment on that? Not on their next book, but on the larger question.
I'm looking forward to that. I think a lot of why it is so interesting and important to be raising taxes on the wealthy is to fund programs that are going to benefit the middle class and low-income workers. And so it's really important to keep those two goals in mind. And I think a political candidate would, not necessarily be advised to only talk about the spinach and not about the dessert, but in a serious book, those are two big issues to explore, and I think it makes sense to peel off one of them. Going back to your revenue maximizing question, I think reasonable people can disagree. On the one hand, there clearly are costs to our democracy and to our sense of community for having real extreme concentrations of wealth at the top. On the other hand, if you go past the revenue maximizing rate, you have less revenue potentially than you could otherwise for social programs. The good news, I think, is that we are nowhere near that level. So going back to Paul's comment, I think we can go a lot further on taxing the wealthy before we need to be worried about exceeding the revenue maximizing rate.
So this is time for my last question then, taxing the wealthy. So a political question. It's election season. Again, I hope we're still having an election. One worries. I haven't heard any news since this morning, so I think we're still having an election.
You missed a lot.
We are? Yeah, I know. I get that. Okay. Assuming we're still having an election, Gabriel, you and I were talking about this yesterday. For the first time in quite a long time, Americans seem to be willing to discuss the idea of a wealth tax, and obviously at least three candidates are now supporting that. Why now? Why do we think we have this openness specifically to a wealth tax? And do you think that this is politically sustainable? And I'm curious to hear from you and the others if you have a thought about that.
I can start. I think one reason is the growing realization that wealth inequality has increased tremendously. It was not super clear, a few years ago. Now it's very clear in all the data, whether survey data, tax data, you see a huge rise in wealth concentration over the last decades. The second thing is there was the Trump tax reform, in 2017 kind of forced all Democrats to come up with an alternative, and since there is so much wealth at the top, it's natural to think about wealth taxation. Third, is the power of ideas. Thomas Piketty's book, 2014, makes the case for global wealth taxation, and people talk a lot about that, and ideas matter in the world.
Last couple of thoughts, Paul and Lily, last thoughts?
I want to grab our colleague Leslie McCall and bring her on stage here, because my understanding is that polling has pretty much always showed strong support for higher taxes on the wealthy.
But a wealth tax? A wealth tax?
I'm not sure that people understand the distinction between a wealth tax and just higher taxes on the wealthy. But the idea of making the tax system substantially more progressive at the top has long been politically popular. The question is why politicians are willing to say it now. It has been always something that would play well. I think that comes to issues about the changing structure of the Democratic Party, the decline of the neoliberal establishment, and maybe also, in a weird way, the fact that our politics are now so awash in money that any candidate is going to have plenty of money to saturate the airwaves past the point of boredom and intolerance, so that the candidates don't need the support of billionaires to be serious contenders.
Emmanuel, can I give you the last word?
Yeah, taxes, are of the people, for the people, and they are to be decided, democratically. So please, use our tool, build your favorite tax system, explore what the candidates are doing, complete their plans, engage, in the tax policy debate.
Well, it is my sad duty to bring us to a close. So if I may say so, merci, thank you.